Now, speaking of being better prepared, the scorching droughts in southern Africa could make African nations finally rethink and perhaps embrace genetically modified crops in order to improve yields and resilience to adverse weather conditions like what we're facing now. The dry spell has affected mostly South Africa, Zimbabwe and Malawi. It's been mostly exacerbated by El Nino. Now, the aid agency Oxfam has said 10 million people, most of them in Africa, face hunger because of droughts and poor rains. That has brought GMO crops to the fore again, especially for maize. It's a staple crop grown and consumed right across sub-Saharan Africa. Many African countries, however, have banned GMOs, arguing that they will cross-contaminate other plants, pollute the environment, and could have unknown long-term health effects on human beings. Right then, Farai Makutu is live in Zimbabwe's capital of Harare. Let's see exactly how authorities there are responding to this particular challenge. Farai, let's start with a broader picture there. How is Zimbabwe's agricultural sector responding to the drought that's currently hitting the entire region?
Well, Rama, certainly we saw these early warning and alerts being issued about this impending drought, and so as a result farmers have adjusted their planting patterns. The onset of the rains was much later than normal, and it will be a much shorter rainy season, so those adjustments have been made. We're also seeing drought-resistant seed varieties being used, and where possible they're being urged to turn to irrigation, which is ultimately the long-term solution to this. The government has committed funds this year to resuscitating some irrigation infrastructure, so hopefully those things do come online. We'll see these challenges being mitigated, but that's so far the response that we've seen from the agricultural sector here.
What about the long term, Farai? Is there any long-term threats to maize supplies this year, given the drought, the rains had started later than expected, as you mentioned, or are there sufficient stocks within the region in order to plug the gap?
Well, certainly, as that report earlier mentioned, this has affected countries like South Africa, the biggest grain producer, countries like Zambia, which have in the last 2-3 years been witnessing a surplus of grain and maize output. And that's where Zimbabwe has been importing some of its grain to supplement its shortages here. It's unable to do that now because the entire region is being affected. And the talk that we are hearing is that millers here are going to look to markets as far afield as South America to bring in those grains. So clearly, there is a long-term effect. We understand that as much as 15% of the population will require some sort of food aid. So clearly it is a challenge, and unfortunately within the region there isn't much help for Zimbabwe.
Indeed, 15% is an enormous number. Walk us through the current policy that Zimbabwe has on the use of genetically modified organisms. And is this current drought in any way prompting a change in policy?
Well, officially, as you said, the government doesn't accept genetically modified grain imports, but given the severity of the impending food crisis, and the fact that our traditionally non-GMO source markets like Zambia, for instance, are unable to help us out, Zimbabwe may be forced to accept those GMOs from places like South America, as I've just mentioned. What we've seen in the past, where these genetically modified grains have been brought in, their milling is done under very tight and stringent conditions, and perhaps that is what the government will do again now. Long-term, I've spoken to some people within the milling industry, and I think the thinking there is that, look, given the challenges that we continue to face perennially with food shortages and the justification that is there in terms of greater outputs with GMOs, it is a discussion that will happen, and policy change perhaps not yet, but clearly there is a stronger case to accept GMOs.
Indeed, we'll have to leave it there for the time being. Thank you very much for the update. That's Farai Makutu, appointment, of course, in Zimbabwe's capital.